The night Roy DeMeo disappeared, nobody in Brooklyn believed he was really gone. Men like DeMeo didn't simply vanish. They left blood behind, witnesses behind, terrified families behind. But on a cold January evening in 1983, one of the most feared killers in mafia history climbed into a car outside the Gemini Lounge in Flatlands, Brooklyn, and never came back out alive. By then, the streets already whispered his name like a curse. To some, Roy DeMeo was a successful Gambino capo earning millions through stolen cars, loan sharking, pornography, and narcotics. To others, he was something far darker, a machine built for murder, a man whose crew had allegedly butchered dozens upon dozens of people with such efficiency that detectives later called it the Gemini method. Bodies vanished without funerals. Men walked into the Gemini Lounge and were never seen again. And even inside the mafia, where violence was currency, DeMeo had become a problem nobody could control. But the terrifying part wasn't just how Roy DeMeo killed people. It was why everyone around him allowed it to continue for so long. Because the mafia system didn't create psychopaths by accident. It rewarded them. And by the late 1970s, Roy DeMeo had become exactly the kind of monster the Gambino family needed. Until he became the kind they feared. Long before the headlines and FBI investigations, Roy DeMeo looked almost ordinary. Born in Bath Beach, Brooklyn, in 1942, he grew up surrounded by the code of old-school Italian neighborhoods where respect mattered more than law and silence mattered more than truth. But DeMeo wasn't one of those polished, Hollywood-style gangsters who dressed like movie stars and quoted honor codes. He was rough around the edges, volatile, insecure, and constantly hungry for approval from bigger men in the underworld. Friends later described him as someone obsessed with status, terrified of appearing weak, and addicted to the feeling of power. By his 20s, he was already involved in loan sharking and petty crime, working his way into the orbit of the Gambino crime family during the rise of Paul Castellano. Castellano wasn't a street killer like John Gotti would later become. He was a businessman, calculating and corporate-minded, focused on profits above all else. And Roy DeMeo made profits, massive profits. Through car theft rings alone, DeMeo's operation allegedly moved hundreds of stolen vehicles through ports and overseas markets, bringing millions into Gambino pockets. Suddenly, this unstable kid from Brooklyn had value. Real value. And in the mafia, value buys protection. It buys forgiveness. It buys silence. But what happened inside the Gemini Lounge would eventually become impossible to ignore. The Gemini Lounge sat on Flatlands Avenue, appearing from the outside like just another Brooklyn bar where neighborhood guys drank whiskey and played cards late into the night. But behind its walls operated one of the most horrifying murder operations in organized crime history. According to later informants and investigators, DeMeo's crew developed a system so efficient it resembled industrial slaughter. Victims were typically lured inside under the illusion of a meeting, business opportunity, or debt settlement. Once inside, someone would distract the target while another gunman shot them in the head with a silenced pistol. Immediately after the shot, another crew member wrapped a towel around the victim's head to stop blood spray, while others stabbed the body to ensure death and speed up bleeding. Then came dismemberment. The corpse would be dragged into the back, cut apart, and packed for disposal before dawn. It was mechanical, rehearsed, emotionless. The FBI later suspected the crew may have killed more than 100 people, though the true number may never be known. And what made DeMeo especially terrifying wasn't rage. It was routine. Murder became part of his daily business schedule. He'd kill someone at night and attend his son's school event the next morning. He'd laugh at family dinners after spending hours disposing of bodies. Psychologically, Roy DeMeo represented something deeply unsettling even within mafia culture. Traditional organized crime mythology depended on rules. Kill only when necessary, protect the family image, avoid chaos. But DeMeo's crew blurred that line completely. Violence wasn't a tool anymore. It became identity. Men around him, including notorious associates like Chris Rosenberg, Joey Testa, and Anthony Center, began competing for brutality because brutality earned approval. The Gemini crew operated almost like a cult of masculinity built around fear. Younger gangsters saw DeMeo as untouchable because nobody who crossed him survived long enough to tell stories. And the more bodies disappeared, the more powerful his reputation became. But beneath that reputation, cracks were already forming. The first major problem was drugs. Paul Castellano publicly despised narcotics because heroin brought federal heat the mafia couldn't control. Officially, the Gambinos prohibited major drug dealing. Unofficially, everyone knew money mattered more than rules. And Roy DeMeo was making enormous money through cocaine and heroin trafficking by the late 1970s. Castellano tolerated it because the cash flowed upward, but tolerance inside the mafia is temporary. Once heat builds, loyalty disappears fast. The second problem was attention. Detectives, FBI agents, and federal prosecutors became obsessed with DeMeo after bodies connected to his crew started surfacing in increasingly gruesome ways. Missing persons cases stacked up across Brooklyn. Informants whispered about the Gemini Lounge. Wiretaps captured fragments of conversations too disturbing to ignore. Investigators began realizing they weren't dealing with isolated murders anymore. They were uncovering an organized killing machine. And then there was Chris Rosenberg. Rosenberg was reckless, unpredictable, and deeply loyal to DeMeo, but he lacked discipline. In 1979, Rosenberg participated in the murder of Colombian drug dealers during what should have been a simple robbery. The killings threatened massive retaliation from international narcotics traffickers and brought dangerous scrutiny onto the Gambino family. Suddenly, Roy DeMeo's profitable crew looked less like an asset and more like a ticking bomb. Castellano ordered Rosenberg killed immediately. DeMeo resisted at first because Rosenberg was practically family to him. But mafia loyalty has limits, especially when bosses fear exposure. Eventually, DeMeo personally participated in Rosenberg's execution, luring him to his death despite years of friendship. That moment changed something inside the crew. If Roy could kill Chris, anyone could die. Trust evaporated. Paranoia spread. Federal pressure intensified throughout the early 1980s. Prosecutors prepared RICO cases targeting organized crime leadership, while informants slowly emerged from the shadows. One of the most devastating blows came from inside DeMeo's own circle when Frederick Dinome began cooperating with authorities. Every gangster feared prison, but DeMeo feared humiliation even more. By then, he was reportedly suffering from severe anxiety, insomnia, and panic attacks. Associates noticed him carrying shotguns everywhere, checking mirrors constantly, suspecting betrayal at every corner. The hunter was becoming hunted, and the deeper investigators dug into the Gemini murders, the more nervous Gambino leadership became. Castellano understood something fundamental about survival that street killers often forget. The mafia could survive murder charges, but it couldn't survive unpredictability. Roy DeMeo had become unpredictable, too violent, too visible, too psychologically unstable. Men who once admired him now avoided him. Meetings grew colder. Conversations stopped when he entered rooms. Because in organized crime, fear creates power right up until the moment it creates liability. And by 1982, whispers quietly spread through Gambino circles that Paul Castellano was considering the unthinkable, eliminating Roy DeMeo himself. But what happened next would expose the darkest truth Goodfellas and most mafia movies never fully showed. When the mafia decides one of its own has become dangerous, friendship disappears, loyalty becomes theater, and even the most feared killers in America can suddenly find themselves sitting alone in a parked car, waiting for death without even realizing it's already arrived. By the beginning of 1982, Roy DeMeo was living in a state that every gangster secretly fears but never admits aloud: isolation. The money was still flowing through Brooklyn, stolen cars were still disappearing onto cargo ships, and the Gemini crew still inspired terror across New York. Yet the atmosphere around DeMeo had changed in ways he could feel every time he walked into a social club. Conversations stopped too quickly. Smiles looked forced. Men who once begged to sit near him at restaurants suddenly found excuses to leave early. Inside the Gambino family, word had quietly spread that Paul Castellano no longer trusted him. And in the mafia, distrust is usually just the first stage of a death sentence. What made the situation worse was that DeMeo understood the system well enough to recognize the signs. He knew how the mafia removed dangerous people because he had helped remove dangerous people himself. That knowledge slowly poisoned his mind. According to several associates, DeMeo became increasingly paranoid during those final months, carrying weapons constantly and believing federal agents were watching his home every hour of the day. Some nights, he reportedly drove through Brooklyn for hours without destination, checking rearview mirrors and circling blocks repeatedly to see whether anyone followed him. The terrifying irony was that he was right to be afraid, just not for the reasons he imagined. The FBI was closing in aggressively, but the greater danger sat much closer to him, inside the very organization he had spent years enriching through bloodshed. Federal investigators had already begun building enormous racketeering cases against New York mafia families, and Roy DeMeo represented a nightmare scenario for Gambino leadership. If he got arrested and flipped under pressure, the government would gain access to one of the largest murder conspiracies in organized crime history. Castellano could tolerate greed. He could tolerate violence, but he could never tolerate unpredictability. Roy DeMeo had become unpredictable. Behind closed doors, powerful captains reportedly discussed whether DeMeo should be eliminated before prosecutors forced him into cooperation. The irony was brutal. For years, Roy protected the Gambino family by murdering witnesses, debtors, rivals, and suspected informants. Now the same logic was being used against him. From the mafia perspective, killing Roy DeMeo was not betrayal. It was damage control. That is the cold mathematics of organized crime. Personal loyalty exists only while it remains useful to the larger machine. Once a man becomes dangerous to profits or stability, sentiment disappears overnight. Around the same period, DeMeo's behavior reportedly became even more erratic at home. Friends later claimed he suffered emotional breakdowns, periods of panic, and deep depression that contrasted sharply with the terrifying confidence he projected on the streets. He feared prison obsessively. Unlike glamorous Hollywood portrayals where gangsters accept punishment with pride, most real mobsters are psychologically destroyed by the possibility of losing freedom. Roy DeMeo especially understood what federal prison meant because he knew exactly how many enemies waited there for someone like him. He had stolen money, betrayed partners, murdered associates, and terrorized entire circles of criminals for years. A life sentence would not simply imprison him. It would expose him. But despite the paranoia consuming him, DeMeo still tried desperately to regain favor with Castellano. He continued earning aggressively, hoping money could repair the damage surrounding his reputation. In mafia culture, income often buys temporary forgiveness, and Roy clung to that belief like a drowning man. Yet the pressure surrounding him kept tightening. Informants continued cooperating. Surveillance intensified. Prosecutors mapped connections between missing persons and the Gemini crew with increasing accuracy. Detectives studying DeMeo's operations became horrified by the scale of violence attached to his network. Bodies linked to his crew appeared in trunks, alleyways, apartments, and empty lots across New York. Some victims vanished entirely. Others were discovered in pieces. The sheer brutality disturbed even veteran homicide investigators accustomed to organized crime killings. But what frightened authorities most was the professionalism. These murders were not impulsive explosions of rage. They were organized procedures carried out with terrifying discipline. And at the center of everything stood Roy DeMeo, a man whose hunger for approval had evolved into an addiction to domination. Yet by late 1982, even his closest allies sensed the inevitable approaching. Several crew members reportedly distanced themselves quietly, fearing they would die alongside him if the Gambinos decided to clean house. Nobody wanted to stand too close to a condemned man. Then came the final weeks. During January of 1983, rumors intensified that Castellano had officially approved DeMeo's murder. The exact details remain clouded by decades of conflicting testimony, missing evidence, and mafia silence. But most investigators believe the decision had already been made long before Roy realized it. On January 10th, DeMeo vanished after reportedly heading toward a meeting connected to crew business. Days later, police discovered his body inside the trunk of a Cadillac parked near the Verna Club in Brooklyn. He had been shot multiple times in the head and body. Cash remained in his pockets. Jewelry remained on his hands. This was not robbery. It was execution. And the symbolism surrounding the murder stunned investigators. Roy DeMeo, the man associated with countless disappearances and hidden corpses, had himself been discarded like another piece of organized crime waste. Even more chilling was the belief, shared by many investigators, that the murder was likely committed by people DeMeo trusted personally. Some theories pointed toward members of his own crew, including men who had spent years killing under his command. Others believed outside shooters carried out the contract after DeMeo became too emotionally difficult for longtime associates to face directly. Either way, the conclusion remained horrifyingly simple. The mafia had consumed one of its own most efficient predators. And once the body was found, the organization moved forward exactly as it always had, without mourning, without apology, and without hesitation. For the Gambinos, survival mattered infinitely more than loyalty, and Roy DeMeo finally learned that lesson too late. Roy DeMeo's death should have closed the story, but in many ways it only exposed how deeply the machinery of organized crime depended on men exactly like him. After investigators identified the body in the Cadillac trunk, newspapers across New York exploded with headlines describing the fall of one of Brooklyn's most feared gangsters. Detectives hoped the murder would finally crack open the silence surrounding the Gemini crew, yet the opposite happened. Associates disappeared, witnesses withdrew statements, and surviving members of DeMeo's network quietly blended back into ordinary life. The mafia understood something law enforcement learned repeatedly during the 20th century. Fear survives longer than any individual killer. Even dead, Roy DeMeo still terrified people. Families connected to victims avoided interviews. Neighbors suddenly forgot conversations they once shared with investigators. Men who privately admitted knowledge about murders refused to testify publicly because they understood the larger truth behind the American mafia system. Killing one gangster changed nothing when the structure protecting him remained alive. The Gambino family continued operating businesses, unions, gambling operations, and extortion schemes, while Roy's corpse slowly became another chapter in New York's endless underworld mythology. Yet behind closed doors, DeMeo's murder created anxiety throughout organized crime circles because it demonstrated how quickly power could vanish. For younger gangsters who once admired him, the lesson was brutal. Roy DeMeo had earned millions, carried out murders for powerful bosses, and inspired fear across the city, but none of that protected him once leadership decided he represented a threat instead of an asset. The same organization that rewarded his violence ultimately erased him with clinical efficiency. That contradiction sits at the center of real mafia history and explains why so many gangsters eventually become paranoid, isolated, and psychologically unstable. The mafia sells loyalty as religion, but internally it functions more like a corporation built around survival. Friendship matters only while profitable. Respect exists only while useful. Men are valued according to income, silence, and obedience. The moment one category weakens, everything changes. Roy DeMeo ignored that reality because he mistook fear for permanence. He believed his earning power and reputation made him untouchable. In truth, those qualities only delayed the inevitable. Federal prosecutors continued building cases connected to the Gemini crew throughout the 1980s, and the horrifying details that emerged shocked even experienced investigators. Informants eventually described the mechanics of the murders with disturbing precision, explaining how victims were lured into the Gemini lounge, executed within seconds, and dismembered before sunrise. Law enforcement officials suspected the crew committed more than 100 murders, though exact numbers remain impossible to verify because many bodies were never recovered. The scale of violence transformed Roy DeMeo from a local Brooklyn gangster into a symbol of organized crime brutality worldwide. Books, documentaries, and films later examined his story, but many adaptations softened the psychological darkness surrounding the real events. Movies often portray gangsters as charismatic antiheroes trapped by ambition, greed, or ego. Roy DeMeo represented something less glamorous and far more disturbing. He demonstrated how ordinary environments can slowly normalize industrialized violence when money, loyalty, and fear become intertwined. Men around him adapted to murder, because the system rewarded adaptation. Younger associates learned that brutality earned approval. Silence earned promotion. Empathy created weakness. Inside that culture, killing eventually became routine labor rather than moral catastrophe. That transformation explains why the Gemini crew terrified investigators so deeply. The murders were not chaotic explosions committed by unstable strangers. They were organized procedures carried out by men who still attended family dinners, celebrated birthdays, and socialized publicly after disposing of bodies. The psychological compartmentalization was staggering. Roy DeMeo especially embodied that contradiction. By most accounts, he loved his family deeply and remained emotionally attached to his children. Yet he simultaneously participated in unimaginable acts of violence without visible remorse. That duality shattered simplistic ideas about evil because it revealed how compartmentalized human behavior can become inside criminal systems built around constant desensitization. The aftermath of DeMeo's murder also exposed another uncomfortable truth rarely emphasized in Hollywood stories. The mafia destroys its own members far more consistently than it defeats external enemies. Most major organized crime figures eventually end in prison, exile, addiction, paranoia, or violent death because the structure itself rewards short-term survival over long-term stability. Roy DeMeo's rise depended entirely on his willingness to become more ruthless than the men surrounding him. But once he reached that level of ruthlessness, he became impossible to control safely. The Gambino family did not eliminate him because he lacked loyalty. They eliminated him because his loyalty could no longer outweigh the danger attached to his existence.